So Mark, as an advisor to Carbon Tracker, why have you decided to do this report looking at coal in Southeast Asia?
Almost if you're an investor, you sort of worry a bit more about the listed markets in oil and gas because you've got $2 trillion or more of so-called capital expenditure that you might not need if you're headed to 2 degrees. You know, the last 2 or 3 years working with Carbon Tracker, we've looked at the fossil fuel industry, how it relates to the so-called carbon budgets, how much emissions can be emitted in relation to, say, a 2-degree budget.
But Mark, we've had a lot of good news coming out of China. This big move away from coal, a real focus on clean energy and pollution. So, I mean, aren't they on the way to solving the problem and transitioning away from coal?
Well, I think there has been a lot of good news in China and in India. In China, we've seen a peaking of coal consumption over the last few years, which no one had anticipated. And in India, we've seen a very large scale up in renewables, and a lot of talk about doing that, and that's been the case in China. So, I mean, in China, coal consumption does appear to have peaked over the last 2 or 3 years, something that no one would have ever imagined. The economy's become less carbon intensive, and there's been a bigger effort by the Chinese authorities to bring on other alternative types of energy like renewables and so on. And in India, we've seen a very serious attempt to scale up renewables. However, that's great, but is it going to go fast enough for the 2-degree outcome? And what's going on at the moment? Well, what concerns me, and I think many people that I've drawn on in this paper, we look at many people who have contributed to this, Greenpeace, Coal Swarm, and so on, as well as Carbon Tracker. And what you can see from the data is that the amount of coal plants, thermal coal plants in the electricity system that's under construction as we speak. It's a very large number in China, like there's 200 gigawatts, and in India, 65 gigawatts. So unfortunately, although things have stopped being drastically dire, they're still very, very challenging, and that data shows just how challenging that is.
So, I mean, the probabilities, without a drastic change in direction, as you say, is that we're going to overshoot. So, I mean, clearly, that is going to be an important part of the equation here. So carbon capture and storage, so-called CCS. I mean, has that got a role to play here?
Well, I think it's very interesting, yeah. Most of us have been rather skeptical about so-called carbon capture and storage, CCS, because there's been so little scale-up, there's been so little demonstration of it. And the cost is very unknown. But when you look at the magnitude of the task, particularly in China, and particularly given the way China is structured in terms of how it plans what it does, then I think that there is a good chance for China to at least look at carbon capture and storage. Particularly, I'm going to say, outside of the power sector, in steel and cement, as the IEA always points out, there are no known easy technologies to capture the
industry
carbon
themselves, and the governments, Indian government talk about this, but the coal industry itself talk about, talk about the benefits of more clean coal, more efficient plants.
We did do a fairly detailed study, a new study in this, on what they call high efficiency, low emission coal plants and these ultra supercritical. And however we combine that, the amount of decarbonisation that is required by, say, 2050 is almost total.
Well, then what about the alternative technologies, the clean, renewable technologies? Can they do it? Can they carry the load? Can they provide the energy these countries need?
There's been so much work done by so many people on showing that technically and in engineering terms, there's no doubt that you could have a very clean, flexible, smart energy system, a flexible grid, a smart grid. I myself and many think that storage, energy storage, will be a big key to this. And we are seeing the emergence of energy storage commercially and scaling up. Carbon Tracker recently produced a very interesting report testing how far that you could see the cost of renewable energy falling over the next few years.
Well, these countries could potentially be a blank canvas, couldn't they, on which you build this new energy system. I mean, the danger is if you lock in old technology, you make that harder.
But our belief, and we've again at Carbon Tracker wrote a paper on this, that when you look at the possibility of rolling out this distributed solar, with storage and backup, it may be a lot more flexible and a lot faster and cheaper to bring access to all those people in India. Now on China, they have already built one of the largest existing power grids in the world with huge amounts of fossil fuels in it. So for them, it's the same problem that everyone else has got.
So what do the governments and policymakers in Asia need to do then? How can they facilitate this transition most efficiently?
I actually think there's one rather sort of simple, low-hanging fruit, and that is what is called electricity market reform. So I think surprisingly for many of us, in the OECD, you have these dispatch processes where low-cost renewables run first. What's happening in China and India and other Asian countries is that they have allocated through lots of different systems they have, that the coal plants get a guaranteed allotment to, in a sense, run first. That is really supporting those coal plants, which can stay reasonably profitable even in difficult times. I mean, in fact, though, in China, the demand for energy has fallen so much that you've seen both what they call curtailment in renewables, there's too much of them, and in the coal-fired stations where their load factors have declined to 50% or lower. But the coal stations in most provinces in China and throughout India, they still get a priority to get to market. Now, if that priority, and the Chinese have definitely have got policies that could change that, and they're doing good work on it, and they're looking to change it, I'm sure. But if they did that, that simple idea could quite revolutionize how the relationship between coal and renewables went. I think the other side of that, though, I think quite simply, all these new coal plants are just unneeded. Therefore, have a moratorium. They've already got versions of moratoriums. Just pull back, because you could overload and you could get stranded assets. You could get problems. In the long run, I think that you've got to have a much more structured carbon market approach. You've got to have caps. Now, there are caps on consumption, have been talked about and actually implemented in parts of China, and that, I think, is another way of expressing it. But that will have to be ultimately reflected on, I think, caps in the power sector on the amount of emissions. One of the calls in the paper is that we're hopeful that the Chinese 5-year plan of sometime in the next very soon is going to look at all these necessary things and give us some hope that there is some real planning and thought going into this. And again, one has to say about China is that when it wants to do it, it can do it.
Mark Fulton, Senior Advisor to Carbon Tracker, the Carbon Tracker Initiative, thank you very much. Please do follow future videos on the Carbon Tracker Initiative channel. Carbon Tracker are a team of financial analysts who use investment grade analysis to demonstrate that climate risk equals real financial risk and real financial opportunity. Thank you.